All right. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Emily Choquette, and I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Nancy Zucker today for the William K. Warren Foundation Speaker Series. Dr. Zucker is a clinical psychologist and internationally recognized researcher whose work has profoundly shaped how we understand eating disorders, and particularly ARFID, and its relationship to interoception. She graduated with her PhD in clinical psychology from Louisiana State University and completed her internship and postdoctoral fellowship at Duke University. She has spent her prolific research career at Duke University, and in her tenure there, Dr. Zucker has founded and directs the Duke Center for Eating Disorders, is a professor in psychology and behavioral sciences, a professor in psychology and neuroscience, the director of graduate studies in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, and an affiliate of the Center for Brain Imaging and Analysis. She has been continuously grant-funded for more than 20 years, and her research program addresses a fundamental gap limiting the prevention and treatment of eating disorders, a poor understanding of how individuals sense, interpret, and utilize their body signals to guide adaptive behavior, or what we know as interoception. Central to this work is the question of how our visceral signals, such as those associated with hunger, fear, or arousal, are learned, labeled, and regulated across development. Using tools and theories from developmental neuroscience, Dr. Zucker investigates how disruptions in interoceptive processes contribute to the pathophysiology of psychosomatic disorders, again, particularly focused on eating and somatic disturbances, including anorexia nervosa, ARFID, and functional abdominal pain. Beyond her scholarship, Dr. Zucker is widely admired as a mentor, and that's in the capacity that I know her. She's compassionate, warm, and has helped shape the career of many up-and-coming scientists and clinicians, including myself. And so with that, I'm very excited to introduce her and her talk, The Detection of the Phenomenology of ARFID, Considerations to Guide Treatment and Selection.
Thank you for that sweet intro. You're not supposed to make me get choked up before I give a talk. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm going to speak to you all about some work that I've been doing really over the last 20 years. And I show you guys some hot off the presses data that no one's ever seen. So this work is supported by grants from the NIMH, and I do get about $5 a year from Cambridge University Press for my books. Want to disclose that. So we're going to start here. Many of you in the audience are parents, and you perhaps have had personal experience with feeding a young infant, and perhaps even experience knowing that if an infant refuses to eat, it is a particular type of traumatic trigger. Right? You can't offer TV time, YouTube, rewards, money. This kid is unnegotiable, so it is an alarming cue, and I'm going to argue a traumatic memory. And then, if it happens, and certainly if it happens repeatedly, and God forbid if it happens to a level that you're worried about the child's growth and development, the feeding environment can serve as a repeated traumatic trigger, not only for the child who's clearly having an aversive experience with food, but also for the caregiver, right? So what I'm going to talk to you all about, and I'm assuming that you all know virtually nothing about avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID. It certainly appears to have the earliest age of onset of any of our eating disorders. For example, in the clinical trial that I'm going to talk about, the average age of onset was a little over 2 years old. So if you do the math and you identify ARFID early and treatment starts as early as 5, which is currently quite rare, the child has had approximately 2,573 aversive, scary, or unrewarding meals, and it's that extended aversive conditioning that I really want us to kind of think about as we think about the treatments. And the parent has also had thousands of aversive, scary, and unrewarding meals, right? And this is quite different than when we think about treatment for anorexia and this, that, and the other, right? This is a really long time of aversive learning. So we're going to talk about the experience of ARFID, the implications of that experience for treatment. I'm going to share with you a recently completed trial, and then we'll discuss. So the basics, In our diagnostic nomenclature, the authors of the working group who created the criteria for ARFID did something very interesting, which is they proposed causes, right? Which is not typical, right? And when we have a diagnosis. And they proposed 3 causes as examples, but we all know that the minute you put examples into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they become reified, right? And they really shape and constrain research. So my first soapbox of many in this talk is that we should not close our eyes and our questions to look at other causes for ARFID, but the ones that have received the most research are sensory sensitivities, a lack of interest in food, which can look a number of different ways, a lack of inability to sense hunger, and also just a general not finding food to be rewarding. And then a fear of aversive consequences, like the fear you might throw up or choke or develop stomach pain. And of course, none of these are problematic unless they cause impairment. And so the impairment that we might see in ARFID is low weight or failure to grow, nutritional deficiencies due to limited diet variety, the dependence of the child on a feeding tube or nutritional supplement to get enough energy, or that these sensitivities cause them great difficulty in eating outside of the home. Where I focus is that all of these are associated with emotional reactions, namely disgust, anhedonia, and fear, that I think of as kind of, if I can understand those more and target those in my interventions, right, then I might get rid of the outcome. So those are the mechanisms that I focus on. That's as mechanistic as I'm going to get today, so all of you mechanistic people, lower your expectations. All right, so first I'm going to dig fear, right? And so, I study, sorry, my telephone operator look here is a little constraining, right? So I study interoception, right? And the way I think about it in kids, I have learned a great deal from the pain literature. And one of the things that has been very influential to me in the pain literature is this construct of visceral hypersensitivity, right? This notion that kids who with early pain have this kind of heightened sensitivity beyond what can be explained by anxiety or other emotional factors. And so they're just more likely to notice sensations. I'm oversimplifying things, of course, right? But a tickle in their throat, their throat tightening, a stomach ache. And because these things can come on a backdrop of fear, and because these things are intense, these sensations are scary. And because our brains are really brilliant and can help us generalize fear, right, so that we don't have to uniquely experience every new fear stimulus, our brain forms categories. So if I step on a sharp screw, I don't have to step on every screw to know that that's going to hurt. And I don't have to step on a sharp nail to know that that's going to hurt. My brain does that for me. But when it comes to sensations, interoceptive sensations, and if I have this threat hypervigilance about sensations in my body, I'm going to start to be scared of innocuous sensations, right? Any gut signal, even if it's just like the hunger pains or butterflies, right? That's going to be scary. And then I'm going to start avoiding things. I'm going to start avoiding types of foods. I'm going to start avoiding situations. And then that's going to lead to more hypervigilance, and the cycle goes on and on again. And what's been the basis of my work about this cycle is what happens when this cycle happens in early childhood, right? What are the implications of that? We certainly know the obvious ones, like this would be, vulnerability for depression and anxiety because you're avoiding lots of activities that could be rewarding and enjoyable. Certainly that's what happens with pain, so increasing the likelihood of physical and mental health problems. But I'm most fascinated by what happens to a child's emerging self-awareness, right? We know that chronic pain is associated with alexithymia, right? No word for emotions, right? And so what happens when a child develops a fear of their body early in life, and so they don't learn to discriminate the meaning of different interoceptive signals, and as a result, lose these fundamental opportunities to develop self-trust, self-knowledge. And I'm happy to talk about that as it relates to kind of the attachment literature, but I will stay there. So just briefly, right, we can imagine all these different fear conditioning cycles right? For example, you're sensitive to different textures, right? Because you think they're going to make you throw up, or you think they'll make you choke, right? And so it generalizes to all different types of foods. But one of the things, I call this my fear exacerbation cycle, because some of the responses that people have when they're anxious actually make it harder to eat, right? When we're anxious, our throat gets dry, our throat gets tight, right? So you can imagine it doesn't take too much to think about that you're faced with an eating situation, you can start to get nervous, your anxious responses make it harder to eat, which makes you panic more about eating, and kind of around and around we go. And we do see these very panic-like responses of children who are eating. And then your stomach's not getting enough food, so your mechanical receptors are getting more tight, less flexible, right? So food is just uncomfortable, you're getting full faster, right? So you get stomach hurts from eating, so that's an added level of aversiveness. You're not eating any fruits and vegetables or whole grains, so you're getting constipated. So the eating is associated with future pain, going to the bathroom. And so all these things, like I've just named 5 different kind of targets, right, that for an intervention developer like me, it's just like, oh gosh, we gotta deal with all these things. So the first thing that I had to think about in terms of designing interventions for ARFID is that these kids are sensitive to experiences inside their body and the world around them. In terms of anhedonia, right, one of the, there's lots of influences on this, but one of the influences that the parents that I work with talk about is just really bad advice, right, that they get from their parents, that they get from their family members, and that they still get from their pediatrician, although less so, where parents of a kid with ARFID are having to deal with all kinds of biases that we have about indulgent parents, that picky eating is a function of just parents being overly indulgent, kind, and this, that, and the other. And so they're told, if you just didn't have the animal crackers, and the fruit chews in the house, your kid would get hungry enough that they would just eat, the meatloaf and broccoli that you made, and this would be over, right? And of course, parents' history of that is exactly the opposite. That these kids, when they get hungry, probably like your kids, get more irritable. None of us, when we're irritable, are, adventurous, right? We get more rigid, right? We dig in our heels more. And so parents have the opposite reaction. And what I would argue is that hunger actually becomes a conditioned fear cue. So more time passes with no food intake, right? You can imagine that the child gets more agitated and frozen. This happens to my parents of kids with ARFID every day after school. The parent gets more panicked because they know a longer time has been gone without them eating, and hunger becomes a fear cue, right? So my second take home is that hunger not only may be an insufficient cue to facilitate eating, which has been shown in several studies, that there's lower levels of ghrelin in kids with ARFID than otherwise, but in fact, hunger may be a conditioned fear cue for some children. And so parents of children with ARFID are coming to you with a lot of invalidating experiences, right? So as I started off this talk, the parent has experienced an early traumatic event with their child's eating, and so they're working their asses off, right? They're working every meal to try to make sure that things are, to facilitate it so that their child is growing optimally, because they know how important nutrition is to a child's growth. And it's working, what they're doing. At great effort and cost, their child is gaining weight and growing. So when they go into the pediatrician, what the pediatrician is looking at is the growth curve, right? Seeing that the kid is on their growth curve, right? Can't understand the parents' hysteria about what is kind of going on at home, right? Because they believe that if they weren't doing this, right, the kid's growth curve would look quite differently. Right? The pediatrician thinks, oh, this is another neurotic parent, right? Overdoing it, thinking that there's and so the parent feels more invalidated and demoralized. The pediatrician thinks the parent's doing much ado about nothing, right? So just my take home here is like understanding our patient's narrative of symptoms, the developmental history of these symptoms. One is critical so that our patients feel seen and understood, but also critical for them to be willing to do any kind of changes. You have to be seen before you're willing to do something different. And then there's disgust. So disgust is one of my favorite emotions. It's a great, it's an emotion that's designed to protect us from pathogens, right? By the time You ingest something that has, and become contaminated, it's too late, right? So people who are really disgust sensitive are great at noticing irregularities, visual irregularities, smell irregularities, texture irregularities that let you know that something's bad, right? You know this. Some people, you had a roommate in college who just took the milk jug, chugged it, and was just like, spit out, spoil the milk. Whereas you opened it up, you smelled it right away, and just like, oh my gosh, how long, has this been in here, right? So there's huge variability in our ability to sense these things. And if you think about your lunchroom as a child, in the US at least, in Europe, and all over the world, kids have beautiful lunchrooms where there's plenty of time to eat. In the US, we have disgusting lunchrooms where there's no time to eat. And so our kids with ARFID have a miserable time, right? And we interviewed 107 children with ARFID and said, what is lunchroom like? What makes it hard for you to eat lunch at school? So the lunchroom is messy, it smells, it's noisy, kids chew with their mouth open, the sound of chewing. So just all these things, and about 2/3 of our kids with ARFID have at least kind of one of these things that they just find the lunchroom to be. We all find it aversive, right? But for them, they just get so disgusted that they can't eat. Right? So then they come home, they haven't eaten all day, they're hungry, they're frozen, and it goes on and on. So this is important from a treatment development perspective because disgust conditioning actually works very differently than fear conditioning. Right? We do very well with fear, right? Particularly with phobias. It's as clinical psychologists, that is our greatest success, our treatment of specific phobias. And if we had someone who had a fear of spiders, for example, we know what we would do. We would create a hierarchy, right? We would expose them to this hierarchy. We'd start off with little spider storybooks, spider songs, spider stuffed animals, cute little spiders, big spiders, spider movie, all the things. And at the end of exposure, your patient would learn, okay, spiders are not going to harm me. I can go outside of my home. I can see a spider. It's not interfering with my life. But if you ask them at the end of all this, how do you feel about spiders? Your patient would say, I hate spiders, right? You haven't changed their evaluation of them at all, right? And so disgust conditioning is really about this evaluative conditioning, right? Despite the fact that if we're to add it all up, we've all been exposed to vomiting and feces, millions of times, right? None of us would volunteer if I had a jug of vomit or a plate full of feces to kind of hold that in your lap during my talk, right? Repeated exposure, still disgusting. And if we had a context in which these things were particularly aversive, for example, I threw up in the lunchroom, as happens with my kids with ARFID, right, because they're so disgusted. I'm so constipated that I'm actually having caprices and I have accidents in school. Now these things are even more toxic. And the fact is that we all approach disgusting things every day without really thinking twice about it. And so the way to get kids or anyone to approach disgusting things is not to perhaps change the nature of the thing itself, but perhaps the context in which they are approaching it, right? So you don't think twice, maybe you think twice every once in a while, about changing your kid's diaper because it's in the service of caring for the vulnerable, right? These are things that we do because there's a higher purpose, a higher value attached to them. So that was something that I had to think about in treatment. So if I put all these things together, honestly, it became quite overwhelming to think about how do I target all these things, this long aversive learning history in terms of treatments for ARFID. So where I came, we needed to have this validation, right, of this journey, especially of the parent's journey. I needed to have reconditioning so that there's positive memories around food. Perhaps I needed to address this body fear, right? That by altering this quality of attention towards body sensations perhaps that would be a relevant component. I certainly had to create a reward system because these are kids, right, who don't have these higher purposes, like this is hard work and you have to have them mean it. One thing that the eating disorder field does not pay any attention to is whether we get people to like food or to find food rewarding. And one of the things that I really wanted to try was in kids with ARFID, could I actually get them to love food, not just eat enough so that they were growing? And I had to have strategies to make potentially disgusting or scary things approachable. So what I did, So this was a trial of 153 kids that were randomized to 2 active treatments. Never asked me to design a clinical trial for you. I can never manage to do a control group. The clinician in me can't bear to have someone suffering, and so my trials always are a joke in that respect. But you get good trials out of there. So 2 active interventions. One, family-assisted diet, was from this trauma-focused lens. And where I picked was really digging into the last part of the validation and the building of positive memories before we did anything to change the child's eating, right? So we spent time on that. I'll walk you through that. Reward system, and then exposure-based strategies. And so to walk you through just a few of these components, we spent time with the parents in the beginning of treatment really digging into things that I felt were not talked about enough in ARFID, mainly grief, right? Parents, who are having a child, they have these visions about how they want food to go. They might make homemade babies' food. They think of the family eating together. And the fact that parents get robbed of that when they have a child with ARFID is really crushing for some parents. I had parents kind of describe how every day when she was making her child's lunch, which involved grabbing a bunch of different snacks and putting in the lunchbox, she would be crying, right? Because it wasn't the lunch that she wanted to make. She had to work so hard to get those to a point where they could eat the snacks at school, and there was the invalidation that any other parent looking at this lunch would think she's a slack-ass parent rather than someone who's just worked so hard to get there, right? So this sadness that comes in all these different ways. And so we would talk about that, and they would have some journal prompts. And here's an example of a journal prompt. You've tried innumerable strategies to try to improve your child's eating. What emotions show up for you now when you're gathering food for your child, eating or not eating with your child, and what are some ways you could be compassionate towards yourself when you're having these feelings, right? The parent's emotion that they bring into the feeding environment, if I was going to create positive associations, needed to be targeted. And then we did this thing where we tried to collect positive memories, right? So against the backdrop of its extensive learning history, it's probably not surprising to all of you that if you had your kid come cook with you in the kitchen and make muffins, that a miracle wasn't suddenly going to occur where they tasted the muffin that they had and she's like, oh, who knew food could be this good? And from then on out, we're an adventurous eater, right? But that's what all the YouTube videos or the TikTok videos and all the things would have you believe. And so parents have, tried these things and the miracle didn't occur. And so they stopped doing these things because they don't work. And so what I was trying to convince everyone was that they were working, right? But it takes a lot of time, right? So that these positive memories were planting little seeds that was forming positive associations. And the ways that I tried to do that is I had the child kind of give the parent stickers, right? So the child had a jar full of marbles. And whenever they thought that something positive had happened in the presence of food, whether they ate something or not, they put a marble in the jar. And this way the parent could see the marbles increasing, knowing that good things were happening, even though they might not see an immediate kind of change in their child's eating. So that became a very important part. The parents also needed some parenting strategy. We're still talking about building positive memories. They have they've been doing this so long. They see the end goal of what they want. They have a hard time seeing these positive baby steps, right? So you have to train them to shape behavior, right? So you have to train them to notice all these little baby steps towards progress, just like training a mouse to go through a maze, right? If a mouse takes a step in the maze in the right direction, you give a little piece of cheese. You don't wag your finger and say, but look how far you got to go. Right? And so parents needed to do this, and we call this praise and stop, where they notice something the kid did, and there's not a yes, but, and only, and tomorrow. It's just great. And these activities with the focus on building a memory rather than an outcome. And the child, and I'll talk about this towards the end, we also try to change the child's mindset so that they're focusing on what they can do, all the brave things that they can do, so they also don't feel like there's something wrong with them, right? That they're able to do great things. And then we created our incentive system. And in ARFID, and with kids today in general, incentive systems, these gamers, right? They gotta be complicated, right? So we have this whole system of how food, what I learned is that when a child with ARFID tries something, even if they find it to be delicious, they're kind of too rigid to just start incorporating that into their diet. It has to be intentional, right? So we have this whole system where a new food goes from a getting comfortable food, and then we can categorize it, which is particularly appealing for my kids with on the autism spectrum, right? It could be a yummy food. It could be a yucky food. Kids need to have a category where they say, never again, we shall never speak of this. We all have those foods. A good enough food is a food that they can eat, right? It's tasty, it's good, they'll never ask for it, but they can make do with it. They can't eat a ton of it, right? But they can eat enough of it. And a survival food is something when they're in a pinch. And then we went to kind of basic exposure type of stuff, but more like associative conditioning, where they're armed with their tools, right? They have a chaser. If they have a bad taste, they have a way to escape. If they feel like they're going to throw up, they have something to snuggle. They have something to get rid of smells, and then we started just doing classic exposures, right? So these were the components of my FAD intervention. And then for my feeling and body investigator intervention, I said, okay, what about if the traumatic lens is the kid's body that I started with, right? What if you forget about food, and you start with the children's kind of ability to self-parent, right? Their ability to tune into all these interoceptive signals, decode them, and they realize that their body is amazing and smart. How much does that give you in terms of the child's willingness to try food? You still got to reward them, and we still got to give specific strategies for food, but here's where I really wanted to make them curious about food, and I really wanted to directly address the disgust and the scariness. So what we do is, unlike classic interoceptive exposures, we add a level, and I was really trying to alter that initial perception of an interoceptive signal from being threatening to being playful. So every body sensation, not every, but so body sensations are linked to playful characters. This is Gerda gotta go. This is the urge to pee. And they get psychoeducation around this. This is Georgia the gut growler, the growling that you have in your stomach. I started off my original work, I had about 20 characters. I'm up to 110. I'm doing a trial now with just with kids with autism. I'll probably have like 547 different characters. And then they learn the term that I really am fascinated by, this interoceptive responsivity, right? They learn how to label what different sensations their bodies are feeling, to notice, I should say, to label it, right, as type of emotion, type of pain, right, and then to respond to it, right? If you're feeling happy, right, what should you do? You should dance around, right? If you're feeling sad, you might want to reach out to someone, snuggle with an animal, that sort of thing. So they contextualize the sensation, interpret the meaning, and respond to it. And then we did more classic interoceptive exposure types of things. But for kids, rather than proving that a belief isn't true, because these are still just little people that don't really have access to their thoughts or knowledge of their beliefs, what we were doing was more demonstration projects where we would demonstrate just how wicked smart their body is. Right, so we would, we would try to capitalize on prediction error, right, by having the kids say, how many butterflies do you think are going to come out if you sit in the closet? And they'd say, I think 5 butterflies. And so we say, we sit in there and no butterflies come out, and we're like, well, this is disappointing. What do we need to do to up the ante? And then we cut off the light under the door and tell a scary story, and so you're kind of capitalizing on prediction error, you're changing the context of it so it's very playful, you're trying to bring on anxiety, you're doing a lot of things there. And then in the spirit of inhibitory learning, so that the child remembers what you want them to remember, they write down the lesson that they learn, so you make sure that they are capturing. So they might write down, my butterflies are my little helpers. They help me get ready for things and to be prepared. And so this notion of interoceptive responsivity, and that's the first citation I heard talk about it, right? The ways in which individuals value and respond to interoceptive cues, right? I could notice hunger and label it, but if I don't believe it, if I don't trust that it's telling me that I actually need food, I won't do anything about it. And the way I explain this, because none of my patients care about interoceptive responsivity, is really this notion of self-parenting, right? And you can think about body trust and the early attachment literature in terms of a responsive parent responding to an infant's interoceptive cues, right? And the child developing the sense of felt trust and security with the caregiver, right? I think of that same analogy when I'm thinking about a child learning to read those signals, that they actually feel like they trust themselves, they know themselves. I think this is profound in its implications, right? So, but then we moved on. Similarly, we took the same thing and we tried to link body sensations to different tastes, textures, smells, right? So parallel process with the body, now with food. And here's where we try to really hone into the disgust part of the equation. So remember I said that in order to have people approach disgusting things, you have to change the context in which they're experienced. So here's an example. Kids who are disgust sensitive are really keen to notice visual irregularities, right? Because they could be disgust elicitors, right? Brown spots on a French fry are a great example. There's nothing dangerous or wrong about brown spots on a French fry. It's just part of the process of growing potatoes, I guess. I'm not a potato growing expert, but let's assume. So what we would do as an activity is that, you have to differentiate between a rash and a scar, right? So I have the kids look at, okay, what's a scar on your body? Tell me the story of that scar, right? And so we started having competitions where we would look for visual irregularities that are not markers of rotten food. And there would be a competition where the parent and the child had to come up with the story of how this piece of food got that mark. Right, and the kids came up with these very elaborate, knights, battling, stabbed with a sword, healing scars, and the parents would be like, it fell off the truck, and so the kid would always win, and then go, but the whole thing, right? So then now you've created something now wherever, anytime an irregularity comes up, like the families having to each think of a story, and so you've kind of changed the whole context of it. So just as an illustration. Right, and then we do investigations, right, to show about flavors and this, that, like the other. So, for example, they would make homemade lemonade where they've got lemon juice and water and adding simple syrup, 1 tablespoon at a time until they reach the right combination. The parent has simple syrup later for margaritas. Everybody's happy. And then, a competition in terms of if you wanted to layer on the prediction error, how many tablespoons you think it's going to take, all that sort of thing. So those two very different approaches. What we did is this was funded during kind of COVID-ish times, and so we moved everything to telehealth. What I learned is that because you don't have the initial in-person connection, we lose a lot of folks at the beginning. So we lost, not unusual, but 21%, 27% in the fat arm. But once we started, our retention was excellent. So we retained 98% of the families in the FBI arm, 91% in the fat arm. Just like where we started, that these kids have had problems for a long time. So the average age of kids in our sample was 8. About half had feeding problems within the initial weeks of life, a third when introducing baby foods, almost half when introducing table foods. In terms of their early difficulties, and I thought this was really fascinating, child frequently showing disgust for food features, food refusal, lack of interest, right, suggesting that perhaps we could be diagnosing ARFID a lot younger. And they had all had treatment before they came to this trial, right? Feeding-related treatment was in 3/4 of the children, so we need to understand more about what's going on there. Did they have oral motor difficulties that were collected, and now we've got the emotional sequelae left. So only 3% of the children did not have some kind of comorbidity, right? So these are complex kids, right? These are not just I don't want to eat broccoli kids. And this was part of the experimental therapeutics initiative of the NIMH, so I had to define my go-no-go criteria, which was a count variable of the number of ARFID symptoms above clinical threshold, and I had to reduce it by 2. And I even was grandiose, and I said 65% of the sample would be considered a responder charm. I don't know where I pulled that number out of my ass. You know, most trials are like 50%. Like, why did I do 65? What? Oh, so anyway. So here's the results. This was our post-treatment results, and then our 3-month follow-up, right? So we found that an FBI, the average symptom reduction was 8.6. At 3 months, it was not only maintained, but a little increased, that 57% had at least 2 symptom changes 3 months post-treatment. And FAD did even better, right? So they had an average of 13 symptoms continuing to get better at 3 months, and 87% had at least those changes, right? So we're still trying to make sense of these. We have, doing different kind of responder analyses and but I wanted to just take a look at one of the children in the FAD arm. This is CHG. So in terms of her story, right, her mom had severe postpartum depression. Feeding did not go well from the beginning. The CHG refused both formula and cow's milk. She was weaned off of breast milk at 10 months. Initial issues with latching and early reflux, so this kind of eating pain, refused a bottle, so this GERD. She had trouble with baby foods, had trouble with inconsistent textures of table food, started feeding therapy when she was 3, continues to kind of have vomiting when she's really hungry, packing food in her mouth, suggesting that she's anxious about it. Her BMI was just on the cusp of underweight, like just on the cusp of not like healthy weight, but almost underweight, and a lot of somatic fear. So one of the things that the kids did in this trial, cross arms, was when we were doing our data collection, because I'm trying to change their mindset about what they can do, they had to reflect on the hard things that they did this week, right? So here's CHG, she's eating carrots, she's eating guacamole, she's taking care of her dog Birdie. And they had to think about things that used to be hard for me that are easier now, right? And here she is, she's swimming, she's sleeping in a new bed, eating chicken, eating ham, math problems. I have a hypothesis that when you do more interoceptive types of exposures, that it has greater generalization than typical exposures. For those of you that are OCD people, you know that it's a whack-a-mole, right? You get the fear of germs, and now you got to get the other thing, and it doesn't seem to generalize. I have a suspicion that because of you're talking about a child's relationship with their own bodies, that bodes well. And when we did our food exposures, again, in cross arms, rather than doing their anxiety level and showing them that their anxiety goes down, we just really focus on their sense of pride. So they rated how proud they were before they did something and after. And this is kind of interesting. This was the child's ratings of pride before they approached food. And you can see huge variability, which is interesting to think about what this is about. Some kids feel proud of themselves that they're even trying to approach something. Some kids are more conditional, right? They're only going to be proud if they did something well, right? And then, of course, then afterwards, pretty much everyone, this one CHD is a tough customer, and very large effects in that. So just something to think about in our clinical work. So back to memories here. So we asked parents as part of our post-intervention interview whether the work they were doing on the early trauma stuff, whether that was important to them, whether they felt we should keep it. So we asked, was an emphasis on their prior experiences and how you're integrating those experiences a meaningful part of the treatment for you? And here's an example of one parent's response. They said, we have our own food histories and parenting experiences. It framed what we were doing and put it in perspective. It humanized the whole thing. It was important connecting eating to the story of our family and putting it in context. It was important in showing X that he was not alone, and it really brought everything together. It was beneficial. So the take-home points I hope I've made is that early eating challenges create difficult and sometimes traumatic learning histories that may be very intimidating for us to overcome. And in the eating disorder world, we love to focus on weight. And while that's information that we need to keep in view, perhaps our road to health can be more fun. And that maybe by redirecting attention to wonderful moments and creating positive memories while continuing to validate the treacherous and fraught journey to this moment, we can actually build a love and curiosity about food. So this is an email that I got from CHG's mom when she was about 3 months out of treatment. So we're finally on the trip I was dreading, anticipating. I was so nervous about all the ways that X could be thrown into a tailspin, the plane, the food, all the ways this very foreign country is different from her life at home. We came prepared with a suitcase full of safe foods, and Nancy, we have barely even touched it. She's doing so amazing. She has been so brave and open. At lunch today, she reached over and grabbed French fries from her brother's plate. She never eats those and chowed them down like she's been eating them her whole life. I'll attach some pictures of our girl, the world traveler. So thank you. And the invitation is because there's lots of mechanistic work can be done, and you guys are the experts, so it would be fun to brainstorm with all of you. So.
Excellent, thank you. And we have some time for questions. Yeah.
Thank you for the awesome presentation. Now I'm choked up. I had a question about the lunchroom. I found it very fascinating that the kids have like an aversion to it. Has anybody tried to work with schools to try and create like an environment separate from like a lunchroom to where the kids would be more comfortable? Yeah, and I don't know if that seems like a big endeavor.
No, I mean it's a brilliant question. We're hoping to get the paper on the lunchroom out over the next couple months. And I'm hoping that to start creating a dialogue about that. One of the and we're trying to put it into a journal where pediatricians would read it, who can have control over requesting accommodations and things like that, so that we start having dialogues about what are alternatives. There are public health initiatives around lunchrooms, where they experiment with like noise levels, having round tables. One of the interesting things that we did in that lunchroom study is, we asked the kids, what would make a better lunchroom? And so we have all their opinions, and they have things like, one, clean up, which is just like, but also just like, like pastel colors, happy colors, make people have to be not, just like things that are just like seem to be in reach. The ARFID kids had an easier time during COVID at lunch because most people were eating outside, right? And so it's just, that's quieter, it's more fresh air, and so I think there's tons of opportunities. And like I said, and there's lots, looking at kind of European schools and this and that and the other, like it's shameful how our lunchrooms are compared to what they do in other countries. So.
Thank you for the great talk. That was really amazing. So I'm curious about, I'm more familiar with OCD, but I've worked with ARFID a little bit, and I know sometimes in ARFID there can be OCD-like symptoms around food. For example, it needs to be in triangles, or it needs to be in perfect squares, or I don't like to eat round foods. I'm curious if you see that in your kids, and if you think that's sort of just one way that the anxiety can show up, or is there something different going on for those patients?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think so I think the short answer is we don't know. The way I formulate that, though, is I really do think of these kids as having just like very sensitive nervous systems, and I know that that's colloquial, but that one of the ways that the need for sameness and the rigidity that, for example, we see in autism spectrum disorder is just a way to manage input, right? So that they know they want, and it is an anxiety thing, right? In terms of prediction and control, right? When you're anxious, you want to maximize your ability to predict and control your environment. So if everything is the same, right, you know what to expect. Right, so I don't think of it as so much a OCD kind of area, but more akin to kind of anxiety management. It's not necessarily that there's an articulated belief that something bad will happen if the sandwiches are in a triangle, but it just is a very anxiety reducing to have that way, and it makes them feel better. So I think it's a great question.
You mentioned a lot of vicious cycles that emerge. But before these cycles emerge, it does seem to be the case that something like somatic hypersensitivity is sort of the root cause of a lot of these issues, or, for example, something happening like GERD during breastfeeding. Do you think there's any point in intervention at those early levels? Because obviously, if we can sort of catch this at a much earlier level, it's probably less complex, could be potentially less complex to treat. Or is it just too early in general then for us to have any idea about how to treat this?
I think you nailed it. I mean, I think that the one thing that I'm hoping comes out of the paper about these early life events and kind of the early problems is what happens when we target them early. And currently what I don't think that we appreciate the power of memory, right? Of pain memories, of visceral memory, and so even in GERD, if it's identified and treated quickly, right, it doesn't erase the memories of pain. And so I think about education about all those things could have profound implications for changing trajectories. Because I do think that I agree with your point. I think that's the root, or at least certainly a contributor, right? And if it's explained, then parents know what to expect. But again, if the GERD is treated and the baby's eating doesn't go back to what they expect it to be right away, which it wouldn't with painful memories, now the parent's getting anxious because it wasn't addressed. And you could just see with a simple kind of psychoeducation intervention so the parent has reasonable expectations about the time course could be a game changer, in my opinion.
Thanks.
I might have missed it, but with the two arms, with your two interventions, is there a thought that there might be different mechanisms for each of those, or different kids that those two would be effective for? Because I know they both kind of show a nice response, but is there a personalization there that you're hoping for, or?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I proposed a similar mechanism in terms of decreased negative affect in response to food, which we have kind of videos across time for these kids approaching new foods, which we'll take a look at, so we can look at the different types of negative affect and this, that, and the other. And the interventions are sequenced. But I didn't know enough at the time to do like a fancy MOST trial, or do do anything where I could really target each of my components, which would have been, one of those I wish I woulda, coulda, shoulda types of things. And so we measured change across all throughout the trial, and we have these kids really well characterized. And so we're hoping to do a lot of work to be able to inform which for what. For example, I didn't put this slide up there, but we already know that the dropout in kids with autism is profoundly different in FBI versus FAD. In FAD, we retained 30% of the kids with autism. In FBI, we retained almost 80%, right? And so what's going on there? But it was even more confusing because if we retained a kid with autism throughout the FAD trial, where the parent is getting kind of really a focus, they did exceptionally. Right? So what are the cases where the mom just needs support and that really would be helpful? Where is the mom just kind of burned out and really needs a child-focused thing? Are all things I hope that we can learn from this. That's a great question.
Great talk. You touched on briefly the difference between the lunchrooms in Europe and the lunchrooms versus here. I thought that was very interesting, and I wondered if there were different rates of ARFID in those cultures, and if there were other cultural factors that have come up in your research.
Yeah, it's so the epidemiology of ARFID is relatively new. It seems like in one of the things that was very confusing about the ARFID is just kind of all the research on picky eating, which was never well defined. And so in the early days of picky eating, you'd get these articles by French researchers saying, well, we don't have picky eating in France, because we, have really good food and we have really good lunchrooms. And so, so you get that kind of thing. As we're getting more into genetic studies, then it's showing that it's pretty consistent throughout. And so, but who knows, right? There's a need for more kind of data about that. So be curious to hear about the lunchrooms in Ireland.
I feel like we didn't have lunchrooms.
We'll see that. Maybe that's a wonderful thing.
feel like you would bring your lunch and you would eat it in your classroom and then you'd go and play. Well, there weren't really like, they don't have classrooms?
Yeah, you have to rent classrooms.
When you're in high school? No, we didn't have like food that you would buy at school generally, I would say, in the Irish public school system.
So,
No.
so that could be, everyone's got their own space. I could see that being positive.
Yeah.
And, then
And everyone had their own food that they brought from home.
Yeah.
It wasn't really a thing. Or like they'd go across the fish and chip shop.
Yeah, I still have memories of, there was this vending machine in my middle school where they had these like canned beefaroni, beef ravioli, and you just like the pop top and just the smell of the, like I have a very vivid memory of those. So.
Any final questions? Now I'm over here.
Thanks so much for the talk. I was really curious about like sort of like re-triggering events. Like maybe like a child like really makes good progress toward some foods, but like I don't know, like what have you found to be like things that disturb the process?
The child getting sick. Right, like it just like it's a whole, like whenever if a child is kind of getting sick and does, like has a lower appetite for a day, like it's amazing how much that sets the whole. It's a great question. Like it sets the whole thing back. And why is it? Is it because there's such well-worn memories of that, and the kid regresses and goes back, or is it because the parents are so panicked about it, and the combination of those things, and this, that, and the other? But there's no published research on this, but just clinical anecdotes. But the child's weight loss when they get sick is a remarkable. Like you're working so painfully, they get sick, poosh, and then they have to kind of go through the whole thing again. So it's a great question.
Thank you, Nancy. That was great. Where are you at? It's hard to find providers who have a lot of experience in doing ARFID. Where are you at in the manualization process as far as for experienced providers to be able to do these interventions with patients?
Scott, it's like I put you in the audience to ask a question. So if you guys want, so I do have this, if you email this thing, we do have these monthly meetings with providers where we do case consultations, and then in March again, more like April, I'm going to be starting to do the kind of monthly trainings. They're free. They're always free. So they're just kind of Zoom meetings, an hour a week, and so I can certainly remind you when we start up again. But if you email this email, then you're on the mailing list, and then you get to hear about all the trainings and things like that. So, sure. I should have this up. So. My team.
Well, if there are no further questions, thank you very much, Dr. Zucker. It was a great talk.
Thank you.